All right, what is up, play-by programmers? Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about faction registers on our Behavior Basics Part 5. This is going to be the last of the sort of variable style behavior basics. And honestly, if you've gotten this far, if you've watched all the information about how to get and store different data in all types of different ways, you're probably well on your way to being able to figure most of this stuff out for yourself. After this, once you know how to get the data and how to store the data and all the different places you can do that and how to communicate with that data, then you should be able to mostly use a pretty simple like guess and check method for setting up the proper sequences of other nodes to get the things that you want to get done. Now we will go over some mathematics stuff, some common things that I think people are going to run into, but it does mean that we're probably going to be slowing down the rate at which we put these videos out because I'm still personally learning. So I'm going to have to get to a point of proficiency with some of these other things before I'll feel comfortable coming in and trying to teach them. But this one should give you a good foundation of how to get most of the things you're trying to do done in the game. So let's take a look. Faction registers are an extremely powerful system for storing and communicating data within your faction. And that means all of your units, right? All of your vehicles, all of your structures, everything is going to have access to these faction registers. And so information can be transmitted all the way across the map, no matter what, no matter where, by using these faction registers. And anybody, any vehicle, any building, anything can get access to them. So they can be extremely powerful. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to set up some faction registers. So the way you're going to do that is if you come down here into the bottom right of your screen, you have your control system that you can open up, or control center, sorry. And down in the bottom here, you've got faction. So you can open that up and it's going to give you a bunch of information about your faction up here. And it's going to give you a bunch of information about your relationship with other factions down here. So this is fairly useful information. It's something you're going to use, to set up your status with your different factions and stuff like that. So if you were playing in like a multiplayer game, you'd probably use this a decent amount. But anyway, so there's that. The next thing is you're going to want to click this Manage Faction Registers here. And that's going to bring you into your faction register screen. Now, in order to use a faction register in one of your behaviors, you do first need to come over here and create that faction register. So the way you do that is really simple. You just open up the Add New Register, and then you give it a name. This is a test register. And then you give it a radio band. Now, this radio band acts as a transmitter. So whatever radio band you pick, you can either use a regular regular receiver to pick this up, or you can also use the radio event command in your behavior to trigger interrupt actions based on this particular register. And that's actually really, really powerful because it means you can use a radio system, right, a transmitter system, without actually needing receivers and transmitters by having faction registers like this. And that's really powerful. Now, faction registers, these radio bands are actually really interesting because you can use pretty much any ID combined with any number to create a radio band. So you can have lots and lots of information transmitting across these radio bands. Now, this is one of the few places where you can use, where you can use these letters, although I'm having trouble finding them. Why don't I seem to have access to the letters here? That's interesting. Something seems to be wrong. Because normally you would have access to these letters to choose your radio band. Because it always triggers this R as the default. I wonder what's happening that's keeping me from being able to do that right now. Maybe I've set up like a weird... I don't know. That's crazy. Anyway, so this is where you set up your band. And you can set these radio bands to anything. You can set them to colors. You can add any number you want to them, right? So this could be blue 6. Could be the radio band for this test register here. Pretty much anything you want, you can go ahead and add that in. And then when you go to your behaviors, we'll go over here. We'll create a new behavior. And we'll do faction register test. And you'll be able to go in here and you can go to your radio event. Or you could read the radio signal off of the band and get the result. I don't really like using this. I'll show you what I'm going to do instead. But your radio band here, you can go in and you can choose blue 6. And then this triggers anytime the value in blue 6 changes, which is really cool. And then you could also just get the value, right? This is a called node, and this is an event node, right? So this happens and it interrupts whatever's happening in your program because it's an event node. And it starts this is like the beginning of a chain of behaviors. And this can just be called anytime. Personally, if I'm trying to get the value inside of one of my registers, I prefer to just use copy. And then I just copy the value out to a variable. Right, this is a test variable. So I like to just copy that value out and go ahead and put it in a variable inside my behavior if I need it, if I need to manipulate it just for this behavior here. You could just read it right out of the band and get the result, and that would work just fine. But I prefer to just click this here, and I'll explain to you why here in just a little bit, because things can get pretty broken if you do it this band way. So we'll have to, we'll explain that here in just a minute. But then you can also use this copy value. This read radio is just a get. This copy can be used as both a getter and a setter. So I can also change this value to this variable, and then I can change the target to this is a test register, and go ahead and put that in there. And what that means is now this value is going to be placed inside of this faction register. So anybody else who is listening on that radio band, or anybody who pulls this faction register after this is set, right? This is how you communicate between units in your faction. So you can copy values to and copy values from those registers, as well as listening on those radio bands for changes. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's go back down to our faction registers here. And then let's look. You can set a default value if you would like. So I could just like set this value to 10. And then that would just kind of be its default value. As soon as it started to get changed, it's not going to go back to this value, but it will change. So you can set this up if you want it to start at 10 when you build the register. You just go ahead and set it. And then it's really easy to get rid of registers. You just click this little remove button and boom, this whole faction register goes away. You do have to be careful, right? Because if you have this tied into a bunch of your code, this could become a problem if you get rid of this register. But this is just a really good place to store information that your entire faction needs to know about. And it's a really good place to communicate between different units because you have the ability to make ultimately an infinite number of radio bands and communicate on those radio bands. You can set up, little squads. You can set up, your engineers and stuff to be listening. You can set up combat squads to be listening. You can set up storage structures to be listening and transmitting on certain bands. This is really the backbone of what you're going to be doing when it comes to communicating stuff across your faction. Now, a lot of the people that I've spoken to really like to use this signal register to transmit data and then loop signals to get that information. And I can definitely see some value there. And I'm going to look into that, and we're going to make another video more specifically about signals in the future. But I really think that understanding faction registers and understanding these radio bands and all of that information is a really, really good way to communicate information across your faction. Now, there is one sort of problem, and it's something that I've run into a lot, and so I'm just going to show you the way I've solved that problem, and that is whenever you're listening on a radio band, you don't get a reference to the unit that sent the transmission. And that is something I have needed in almost every case that I use a radio event. So when I copy, right up here in my program, if I copy a value to this thing here and somebody else is listening, right? If I copy a value to that faction register and I know that somebody else is going to be listening to that radio event, I will have another faction register that is specifically for the reference to this value here, and I will copy into that register before I copy into this transmitter register. So for example, if I was asking for some assistance killing a certain unit, and so let's go back to our faction registers and let's change this. We'll manage our faction registers, and this is going to be kill unit request, right? So this will be the faction register that I use if I need combat units to come kill here. And then I'm also going to add another that says kill unit requesting unit. Okay. That's a little hard to understand, but what I'm talking about here, the reason I'm putting this in here, and I'm going to put this right adjacent to this, right? So this is going to be blue 7. And the reason I want to do that is when I go into my program, I want to pass myself, right? So I'm going to get a reference to myself, and I'm going to pass that value into this requesting unit, kill unit requesting unit, and then I'm going to pass the unit that I want to kill, right? So we're going to want to rename this. So unit to kill. And so I'm going to pass the unit that I want to kill into this other value, which is kill unit request. And so the reason I want to do that is now I'm going to have other units listening in on this radio band for requests to kill units. And then I can just copy, right? If I want to get the unit that is making that request, because I know that immediately before sending out the request, they put the reference to themselves into this requesting unit bucket, I can immediately, as that first step in my radio event, I can say hit the requesting unit and then pull it out to requesting unit. And now I can act on this unit, right? If I have, if part of my attack squad is healers, right, I can pull this out and immediately go heal that unit that's requesting that because they're probably damaged. Or I can check, their health value or their shield value. Or, I can do all kinds of different stuff with that information once I have a reference to them specifically. I can keep track of whether or not they're dying. I can keep track of all kinds of information. Their location, so that I know, if they do die, I can still go back to that location with more units, do some more exploring, whatever it is. But having a reference to that unit is pretty important. So when you're making those transmissions, you're probably going to want to pair up your faction registers so that you can be getting that reference to whatever unit it is that's making those calls. But faction registers are really easy, right? You just come in here, you make them, you give them a radio band, and that's really it. And they're accessible from all of your units, from all of your libraries, and they're always going to look like this, right? They're going to have these orange values. And so you've got write result to faction register, and then you've got, oh yeah, right. So we're writing to, and then here we've got read from if we put it in the value here. And this is actually really good to look at. A lot of things are going to look like they work with the faction registers. For example, if we do set component and we hit a value, right? We'll hit the value self and we click this to, which is supposed to be we're setting the value to whatever it is we're inputting here. This says read from faction register. It does not say write to faction register. If you use set component and try and write a value to your faction register value, it is not going to work. It pretty much only seems to work with this copy value. So this is how I get all of my faction register stuff done. And then you can listen on those radios. I can listen to, as many radio events as I want. So I can listen to another band right down here. I can listen to that Blue 7 if I really want to. I can listen to any of the other bands that I make. And this is where things are going to get messy. So the one drawback that I've found so far to creating these faction registers and listening on these radio bands is once you save this, right? This is saved now. And I know that maybe I'm going to use this particular code in another faction, right? In another game. Maybe this is part of like my startup code or something like that. And so if I copy this faction register test to my clipboard, and then I go into another faction, so we're going to switch faction down to another survival hermit faction here. So we'll look, I've already got some faction registers in here, but these are different and they're using different stuff. So I can go ahead and paste this in here. And because this code references a faction register, now you're going to see it's not there yet, but as soon as this code gets applied to one of my units, that faction register is going to appear. The issue that you're going to run into is the value is going to be set to this R and then whatever the next number available is. And this is really bad. Because if you've got code, right, if we look in here, if we look at the code on this unit, we're listening to blue 6 and blue 7. But there is no longer a blue 6 and a blue 7, right? So as soon as we copy paste this code in and get these faction registers, we lose the ability to listen on those radio signals if we changed the band at all. And so I think it's probably pretty important to maybe write inside of your faction registers, because these names can ultimately be as big as you want. So I might write in here like blue 6 or something like that, so that I know if I copy this code into another game and I want to use that code the same way that I did previously, then I'm probably going to want to go ahead and change this band to the band that I was using before. And so I can get it set up as a blue 6 here. And then I know. So that seems pretty important, because one of the goals for automation to me is to be able to bring that into lots of different games, right? To be able to compete with other people, to be able to play my own personal games, to be able to have like my own personal server running all the time that I can just kind of come and watch as it grows and expands and, you know, takes up more and more of the world. That's something that I really want to be able to showcase on the streams and stuff like that. So you do definitely want to get something in there that's going to allow you to replicate things the way they need to be if this code is going to get pulled into another game. But yeah, I think that's going to be the end of our little video here. Faction registers, pretty simple to set up, really, really powerful to use. So start, you know, tweaking on some of those things. Start working with some of those things. Try some different stuff out. If you have any questions, or if maybe I didn't explain something well enough, hit me in the comments. I'm pretty much always sitting at my computer, so I'm always around to answer questions. And yeah, if you got any use out of this, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. But I hope everybody has a great day, and I will see you all on the next one.